Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. We're making progress. Hooray. Now, can you see the PowerPoint? Yes? Wonderful. All right, let's move on in life then. Here we go. We're talking about the progressive era today. Oh, shoot. Are we recording? Stop share. Are we recording? Stop recording. We're recording. Okay. All right. There we go. All right. We should be good. For, all right. So we're talking about progressivism today. Progressivism is really what this unit is named, right? So that's the name of this unit. We're talking about the idea of really the government playing a greater role in terms of trying to right the ills of a capitalistic society, right? So we need some level of reform as a result of capitalism in the United States, right? It's not we're not revolutionary here. At least we're not at this point. We certainly don't want to go into like communism or anything like that, but we do want to secure some basic changes that are the result of sort of capitalism. Okay, we have some economic discontent as a result of sort of a depression that occurred around 1893. Frequently, I think your book actually calls it the Panic of 1893, but it's a recessionary period in terms of economics, which is completely normal in the sense of capitalism. I need you to understand that, but people don't necessarily understand that yet. We don't have a very good real idea of that. Populism is a major factor in the progressive era, or in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in which the people are becoming more involved, more well known. They're looking at trying to ensure that the progress from capitalism, I hate to use this word or this term, but that it trickles down, right? That everybody is sort of equally prosperous, which doesn't happen initially, right? So when capitalism first hits, we see massive like wealth explosion for a small group of people. We want honest government, which is an illusion and doesn't really happen, and you'll learn more about that next year in government. And then socialism is a thing. It does exist. There are some socialists in the United States already. There's some people that are advocating for socialism. It's a relatively small number or small percentage. It's not a wildly common ideology, but Karl Marx, the German philosopher, wrote the Communist Manifesto in the middle of the 19th century. So communism as an idea is already around, right? Which is sort of what socialism is very similarly. Okay. So that idea exists. It simply hasn't been practiced or tried anywhere yet to this point. So with the idea of progressivism, so this is a photo from a well-known muckraker named Jacob Riis. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's a Scandinavian name. It's R-I-I-S. If you're taking notes and you want to write that down. But Jacob uses the cutting-edge technology of the time called the photograph. And he takes pictures of basically how poor people live. And so these poor people are living basically in squalor. A lot of Reese's photos and his work is centered in New York City and in sort of immigrant projects and tenement housing. So if you know anything about the tenement housing, um, basically you had I mean, sort of your early form of apartments. But ultimately, like these apartments might be like 2 rooms. So you'd have like a kitchenette family living area, and then you'd have some sort of sleeping quarters. Except you might have like 8 or 9 people living in that little tiny 2 bedroom apartment. And by the way, you notice it did not say a bathroom, right? Ain't no bathroom. There's like one toilet on the end of the hall that everybody in the floor uses. Which on the bright side, like, I mean, y'all don't live nowhere where it's really cold, but like it kind of sucks if you live somewhere where it's really, really cold and you have to like get up in the morning and then you have to like you go use the toilet and you sit on the toilet's real cold. Like that's not a pleasant feeling. But on the bright side, if everybody's using one toilet, like the seat's always warm because somebody was just sitting on it. Right? Yay. Okay. So that's Reese, right? Reese is a muckraking journalist here. Um, he's one of many at the time, and so muckraking journalism is really this new idea. And when we say journalism, we're really talking about more than like newspapers. Um, Really, anybody that is trying to educate the masses about some of these societal problems. That's really what it is. Um, Another really good example of this is um, Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book called The Jungle in like 1906. It was actually like a book, it was a novel, but it still counts as muckraking journalism, right? He went in sort of undercover into a meat packing plant and found out that the sanitary conditions in meat packing plants were not good because like rats would be running around the plant and then they would like fall into the little grinder and they would get like ground up and then you'd have some rat in your ground beef. Yummy, right? Or, people like y'all who aren't really paying attention in life and they're like slicing up like beef ribs or whatever. Like, I don't know if you've ever been to like an actual butcher, like a slaughterhouse, but like they have these massive bandsaws, right? That are just like constantly going and you just send the beef through and then all of a sudden you're not paying attention because you're on your phone and whatnot. So there goes your finger, right? And now your finger just go down the conveyor belt and it gets ground up and put into the ground beef, and now you got a little Johnny in your hamburger, right? Yay! Y'all hungry for breakfast yet? No? Y'all gonna become vegetarians? No? Okay. Just checking. What? Yeah? Don't don't blame her. Don't blame her at all. Um, so there's also a rise in um, sort of social progressivism as well. So as society has advanced, as society has made gains, sort of financially, and we have technological advancements. There are some issues as to what to do with um, sort of other aspects of society. So again, religious reformers within American history are fairly common occurrence, right? We have significant periods of sort of religious revival. I mean, we call it revival because like all of a sudden we become super religious and then we stop caring about God again. And then we're like, oh, we're a bunch of heathens and we need God. And then we don't care about God and then we need God. It's kind of like the economy. Like it goes up and then it goes down and we love Jesus and we don't care about Jesus and whatnot. So there is that aspect. And then additionally, I mean, religion on some level is used in order to try to make you feel better about your lot in life, right? Like, so if you're working in like a meat packing plant and literally like you're just slicing up ground beef like all day long, or slicing up, you know, beef ribs all day long, and it's a long monotonous job, and it stinks in there because it smells like rotting flesh and rotting meat, and like you just don't like life. Like life really isn't fun at that given moment. um Religion helps you, because if you love Jesus and you love God, you get to go to heaven, and heaven is so much better than this. So it's okay. Just be a good person for this short period of time, and then you get eternity in heaven, which sounds wonderful, right? Yay. I can deal with anything for like 50 years, so long as I get an eternity of like bliss and joy, right? Additionally, there are also some like organizations that are created around this time, things like the Salvation Army, the YMCA, which is the Young Men's Christian Association. These are organizations aimed at trying to help the economically disadvantaged, right? So this is sort of the idea of Christian charity, because at this point in U.S. history, government is not in the charity business yet, right? Like we don't have welfare, we don't have Social Security. Government's not getting handouts. If you're poor and you can't make it, the handouts come from like Christian organizations, right? Like it's Christian charity, not sort of government charity yet. And then settlement houses, those are basically aimed at trying to create some reform within the cities, right? They're generally looking at trying to, educate people, try to provide a better lot in life. And settlement houses also become a significant sort of opportunity for women, right? Like there's not a lot of opportunity for women. Women don't go to work in the factories yet because we haven't gone to war, right? Women are still very limited. They don't have the right to vote yet. So settlement houses become an opportunity for women who went to like Vassar or some sort of women's college to take that education and then go and try to educate other people about basic things like finances and like how to balance a budget and how to not spend all your money in the bar on Friday night, because that starts happening with shift work as well, right? Like guys go to work all week long, and then Friday at like 6 o'clock they get the paycheck, and then they take their paycheck down to the bar, and then they get drunk, and then they go home and then they beat their wives and they're broke, right? Yeah. I mean, seriously, like sadly, like that's actually kind of accurate. And women had no recourse. Like, I mean, literally, like in some of the more sort of negative stereotypes of this, I mean, women would essentially, like the husband would get drunk, right, at the bar, and then he would come home, and then the woman would basically have to like rob him. Like she would have to pick his pocket for the rest of his paycheck so that she could afford to buy like groceries and feed the children for the rest of the week, right? Which isn't ideal, but that is what it is. We do have the women's suffrage movement, right, that is beginning as well. So the suffrage movement is again an opportunity to try to get women the right to vote. Like I said, when we're looking at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, women don't have a right to vote yet. But the progress is coming. There were a lot of women under first wave feminism who felt like when we passed the 15th Amendment and black men got the right to vote, that we would have like given white women the right to vote at the same time. We didn't, right? Which I do think begs the question, like what is a more suspect class within society, race or gender? Which is a fascinating question. If you ever want to take a sociology class, we're not going to get into that here. But I mean, black men got the right to vote. Now, granted, in the South, it was systemically taken away from them. But in the North, like in Chicago or New York, like black men had the right to vote roughly 50 years before white women did. But on the bright side, as we get to this point, then the United States is expanding. We already talked about the lack of the frontier, right? We don't have a frontier anymore. All the states are full. States, in order to become a state, they have to meet certain requirements, right? One of those requirements is you have to have a certain voting age population. So states like Wyoming figure out like, all right, because like 500,000 people live in Wyoming today. Yes, like nobody lives in that state. That state sucks apparently. Okay, like 500,000 people live in Wyoming, right? You realize that that's like 5 sugar lanes for the entire state of Wyoming. Yes, are we there? Wonderful. We get that concept. So, in order for Wyoming to become a state, they need voters, right? How do they find voters? Hey, we're gonna let the women vote. If the women get to vote, we're gonna have enough voters, we can become a state. Right? So some states actually offer suffrage to women before the national government and 1918, right? So again, when you look at some of these Western states here in the green and whatever that putrid yellowish color is, like they're giving women the right to vote well before Eastern states, and again, largely because that's sort of what's necessary for them to obtain statehood. We do have political reforms through the progressive era as well. So we're not just aiming to fix or to correct capitalism. We're also aiming to correct and fix politics, as politics is somewhat corrupt. And especially as capitalism creates these really, really wealthy people, then they have more access to politicians. They have more influence. Up to this point, so the 17th Amendment here in 1913 changes how we get our senators. Right, up to 1913, right? So just 100 years ago, basically. And 100 years ago, senators were appointed by state legislatures. We didn't get to vote for our senators, right? Like Ted Cruz would get his job because he basically like contributed a whole bunch of money to the campaigns of a whole bunch of people in the Texas state legislature. And they were like, hey, Teddy boy, here's your job. You can go to the Senate, right? Like literally kind of buying a job. And that's an issue, right? So that's one of the reforms that we see with the 17th Amendment. The direct primary is another one where the parties lose a little bit of control. You'll learn more about that in government next year. But the parties lose a little bit of control, and the people have a little bit more say in who the actual candidates are for offices. Initiatives, referendums, and recalls are more democracy as well. So again, we're not a democracy. We were never democracy. Again, stuff you'll learn next year in government. But we are looking at trying to create at least a little bit more of a sense of democracy. Initiatives are things that are on the ballot that people put on the ballot. A referendum is something like the government puts on the ballot, but people get to vote for. And then a recall is what's about to happen to Gavin Newsom, where you can basically kick an elected politician out of office, which is awesome. The efficiency movement, right? The efficiency movement is really this idea of trying to reduce corruption, of trying to make government more efficient, and sort of, again, a little less corrupt. That also moves into business as well, right? So the antitrust legislation, the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act are pieces of legislation that are aimed at stopping monopolies, essentially. So when you hear the word trust, trust is also a monopoly. And you should understand, or hopefully you have a basic idea, that monopolies are bad because monopolies are bad for competition, right? They're an opportunity for unscrupulous business practitioners to basically price gouge, right? Like if there's no competition and it's a good that you have to have, right? Like it's a product you have to have, then companies can charge like whatever they want, kind of like cell phones, right? Like cell phones, they're not a monopoly, they're an oligopoly, which is a little bit different because like 5 companies or 4 companies, actually I think it's down to like 3 now, own like all cell phone stuff. And so you pay like way more for cell service than what you really actually probably should, right? If we had a true free market. Okay. Some more sort of progressive ideas and progressive aims. We are looking at social justice So Ida Tarbell, who was on an earlier slide, like she's writing about lynchings in the South and lynchings of black men, and sort of the social injustice of that. You know, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Temperance is basically just a word for anti-drinking, right? So when we say temperance, it means like no more booze, because the booze is the devil, and it's like hurting our men because they go to the bar after work on Friday and then they get drunk and then they come home and again beat their wives, and you know what I mean. And so it's just it's generally seen as sort of not a good thing. Next, we want to deal with child labor, right? So child labor is actually relatively common in this day and age. A lot of kids go to work in the factories, sometimes as young as like 8 or 9 years old. Now that's a little bit more on the extreme side, but they're also working in relatively unsafe conditions. There's no real regulations on like building safety, on you know, sort of machine safety or shop safety. And so people just take these jobs because they kind of have to, because they need the money, and they're left without a lot of opportunity there. Okay. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory is an example of sort of those poor practices, right? So it was in New York City, and I forget the year, it was in the early 1900s. But it was a seamstress shop, right? So they're sewing clothing. There's a whole bunch of women. And in order to ensure that the women don't like steal some of the cloth, some of the raw material, and like take it home and make their own clothes out of it, every day when they left work, they were basically like filtered down into a choke point before they got on the elevator, and they had like their bag searched by their boss, right? So that they weren't stealing. And then one day there's a fire, and the fire escape, like the stairs are actually locked, like the door is chained shut again, so that the women can't steal anything, right? And the fire escape that's on the side of the building, you know what fire escapes look like in like large cities like New York City? Have you ever seen like a Spider-Man movie? Because that dude hangs out on fire escapes a lot. I don't know why, but he does. Right? Yeah, like 8 people, 8 women, not even people. Like I'm fat, right? Like I'm not talking about like me. I'm not talking about like 8 big dudes. 8 itty bitty, teeny weeny, tiny little petite women got out on that fire escape, and it fell off the side of the building because it wasn't secured to the building very well, right? So now the stairs are locked, right? You can't get out the stairs, can't get out the fire escape. So what's your option? You've got your one little choke point and one elevator to get out. It didn't go well. A whole bunch of people died. Now all of a sudden we realize, hey, we need like building codes, right? Like you realize, like right there, there's 2, not 1, but 2 fire escape plans for this room. Okay? Because of progressive era reforms, we have things like this in schools today. We have fire alarms in schools today. We have building codes to where we know people have come in and inspected this building as it was being built to ensure that this ceiling is not just going to collapse and fall on us at some point in time because somebody cut corners and cut costs because it was like financially advantageous, right? The Supreme Court's interaction with child labor is actually kind of complex because there's instances in which the Supreme Court is going to call some laws unconstitutional that limit like working rights and things like that. Basically on sort of the argument that you willingly accepted the job. The job required you to work like 65, 80 hours a week, whatever it was. Like you took that job. You didn't have to take that job. Nobody forced you to take that job. You voluntarily took the job. The job says 80 hours a week. That's what you agreed to. Like that's a you problem. But you also have to realize that the court is a very conservative court at this point, right? Like, it's a very hands-off, like, we're not going to get involved, like free market sort of capitalism conceptually, right? Next, we get the 16th Amendment. Again, this one's 1913 as well. This is one that drives me crazy, but apparently, because we had to have an amendment, the Supreme Court said that income tax was unconstitutional. You know what income tax is? You got a real job yet? Where you work? You had one, right? Like, did you get mad at your first paycheck when you looked at how much money they took away? Yeah, right. Like, seriously, okay, sucks. Okay, now look, income tax for the government, like, it matters. Like, the government needs income tax because that's how the government, like, does everything. But yeah, it's required a constitutional amendment. Like, that's how sort of conservative our court is at this point. That the court says the Constitution does not say that you can have an income tax, so you can't do it. Like, literally, it's not in the Constitution. You can't do it. And so 75% of America, because that's what it takes to amend the Constitution, 75% said, hey, let's do it. Take my money. Which obviously I'm not happy with. But yeah. Roosevelt, this is Teddy Roosevelt. So this is the first Roosevelt, right? Roosevelt is generally seen as one of our most progressive presidents, right? So he basically tries to create what he calls the square deal, right? The square deal is this idea of greater government control over corporations, greater conservatorship of natural resources, right? Like, Roosevelt is the dude who establishes the national park system, right? And then regulations to protect consumers, right? Things like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, right? The FDA is how you know the ground beef that you're getting is actually ground beef and not up in Sinclair's little ground Johnny Burger, right? And that's important. Like, and here's the thing. Like, even when you take out like rats or sort of a human finger because it was cut off in an accident in the slaughterhouse, you do realize, like, for religious purposes, certain religions like can't eat pork. Okay, so if you got ground beef, when you went to the grocery store and you bought ground beef, you need to make sure that there's no pork in there. Yes, like, literally, I know kids that won't eat like Starburst because they're like, oh, there's pork product in there. There's not, right? Okay, but like, the stuff that makes things chewy that actually can come from like bone marrow of animals. And pork bone marrow is one of the things that it's made with. Starburst specifically makes theirs with beef, so that people that can't eat pork products, can't touch pork, can't ingest pork, could actually still eat Starburst. Fascinating. Look at that. You learned something completely irrelevant, but hey. All right. But so those are like the big 3 C's of the square deal, trying to create a better life for the people. Roosevelt also looks to uphold a lot of this antitrust legislation. He's actually sort of known as the trust buster, where he's out trying to break up these large corporations that are engaged in sort of nefarious practices, right? Specifically, those practices that are detrimental to the people. Okay, and I think it was like 20 some odd suits that he's gonna like break up. And then the coal mine strike in 1902. This is one of those first instances of a president sort of getting involved significantly in labor disputes, because there's actually a history now where presidents can temporarily nationalize private industries if it's deemed like a necessary industry, right? So Roosevelt actually like sends troops into West Virginia and Pennsylvania in order to broker a deal between the coal miners and the owners. And when that doesn't work initially, Roosevelt actually threatens the owners. He's like, fine, I'm just going to take all your mines and the government will run them because you won't. And then the owners were like, okay, we'll kind of give in to the demands of the workers here because they obviously didn't want to have their profits taken, right? But Roosevelt actually ends up going down as sort of a very fascinating president because he's very what's the word I'm looking for? Polarizing, right? So some see Roosevelt as being, very good for the welfare of the United States. Others see him as sort of a tyrant. Like he's one of those guys. Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Johnson, guys that significantly shift the power of the presidency and sort of the role of the presidency within American politics. And so a lot of people see that as sort of him being this dictator, this Roman tyrant, which is why you have, these two different political cartoons of Roosevelt that are actually both true on some level. And so there's definitely people that saw him as sort of, good to the people and a very progressive, popular president. And then people that saw him very much as a tyrant, as somebody that, didn't uphold the ideals of the presidency. Roosevelt is reelected. He serves 2 terms and then actually retires because there's a longstanding tradition that goes back to FDR about that. But he will ultimately come back on the scene. He creates his own political party called the Bull Moose Party. It's a third party aimed at toppling Taft, who was his sort of hand-picked successor. He was unhappy with how Taft was running things. And so he actually splits the vote, which leads to the election of Woodrow Wilson, which in and of itself is probably not a good thing. So that's the end of the PowerPoint today. Okay. Let's go there. So you have a quiz and a paper due today. So I hope